The rain of late September was not merely a weather event in the city. It was a rhythmic assault, a relentless drumming against the sky-high windows of the Grand Overture Hall. Inside the gilded sanctuary, the sound was muffled, transformed into a low, somber hum that competed with the rhythmic squeak of a mop bucket. Elias Thorne, a man of 42 whose spine had begun to carry the subtle curve of a decade of labor, moved through the darkness of the hall at 5 a.m. In his faded olive drab coveralls, he was nearly indistinguishable from the shadows cast by the velvet-draped boxes. To the world that frequented this hall, the world of silk ties, diamond necklaces, and legacy wealth, Elias was a ghost. He was part of the architecture, a moving piece of furniture designed to ensure that the marble stayed polished and the mahogany remained dustless. He was the man who erased the fingerprints of the elite. He saved the main auditorium for last. It wasn't because it was the largest room, but because it was the only place where the silence felt like a conversation rather than a void. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the rain-streaked glass, it fell upon the center of the stage. There, bathed in a pale, ethereal glow, sat the Steinway Model D. It was 9 feet of ebony perfection, a beast of wood and wire that held the power to move souls, currently resting in a state of regal stillness. Elias stopped. He let the mop rest in the gray water of his bucket. For a long moment, he simply stared at the instrument. His hands, calloused and scarred from years of harsh chemicals and heavy lifting, trembled slightly. Beneath the rough skin of his fingers lay a muscle memory that no amount of manual labor could fully bury. He could almost feel the phantom weight of the keys, the resistance of the action, the vibration of the strings through the floorboards. "Daddy, why don't you play anymore?" The memory of Maya's voice, small and fragile from 4 years ago, echoed in the vastness of the hall. She had been 6 then, standing in the doorway of their cramped, one-bedroom apartment, watching him seal a cardboard box filled with sheet music, Bach, Rachmaninoff, Chopin, and his own unfinished compositions. "Sometimes, Maya," he had whispered, his heart breaking as the packing tape shrieked, "we have to put away the things we love so we can take care of the people we love more." That box had been a coffin. In it, he had buried Elias Thorne, the pianist, the New England Conservatory doctoral candidate, the man who had been told he had the hands of a titan and the heart of a poet. He had traded his dreams for a steady paycheck and health insurance, things his daughter desperately needed. After the world had collapsed, the sound of a heavy door slamming in the lobby jolted him back to the present. Elias quickly grabbed the handle of his mop. He was a janitor. He was not a poet. He was not a titan. He was a man who cleaned. As the morning progressed, the Grand Overture Hall began to breathe with the frantic energy of preparation. Tonight was the Autumn Gala, the singular event that funded the hall's entire season. It was a night for the city's 200 most powerful millionaires to gather, drink vintage champagne, and congratulate themselves on their patronage of the arts. Elias moved like a phantom through the corridors. He nodded politely when a caterer barked an order at him to move a tray. He apologized when he stepped out of the way of Sarah, the frantic event coordinator, who was clutching a clipboard as if it were a shield. "Elias, make sure the brass railings on the grand staircase are spotless," Sarah called out without looking at him. "The donors will be here at 7. I want to see my reflection in that metal." "Yes, ma'am," Elias replied softly, his head bowed. Acknowledgement was never expected. He had learned long ago that in this building, he was a function, not a person. He was the eraser of messes, the silent witness to the arrogance of the wealthy. By 6:30 p.m., Elias had changed into his evening coveralls, a slightly newer version of the same olive uniform. He was stationed near the service entrance of the main hall, standing in the periphery of the light. The guests began to arrive in a parade of luxury. Men in custom-tailored tuxedos that cost more than Elias's annual salary stepped out of Blacktown cars. Women in designer gowns that shimmered like liquid moonlight glided across the floors he had spent 8 hours polishing. He recognized many of them. There was Julian Vane, the hedge fund titan who always left his half-empty scotch glasses on the edge of the stage. There was Senator Catherine Sterling, who had once stepped on Elias's hand while he was retrieving a fallen napkin and hadn't even paused her sentence. And then there was Arthur Langford. Langford was the chairman of the board, a real estate mogul who viewed the concert hall as his personal trophy room. He was a man of silver hair and aggressive charisma, possessing the kind of voice that demanded the air in any room it occupied. Elias had a particular reason to avoid Langford's gaze. The man had a cruel habit of making sport of the service staff to amuse his inner circle. Ladies and gentlemen, Langford's voice boomed as he took the stage, the wireless microphone amplifying his practiced enthusiasm. Welcome to our annual Autumn Gala. Tonight, we celebrate the transformative power of music. Applause rippled through the room like a well-rehearsed wave. Elias watched from the shadows, his jaw tightening. He thought of the $200 tickets, the price of a week's groceries for him and Maya. He thought of the conservatory where he had once studied, and how the music played here was a walled garden, accessible only to those who held the right keys. Midway through the evening, Sarah appeared at Elias's elbow, her face pale. Elias, there's been a disaster in the green room. A tray of red wine. It's everywhere. The string quartet is about to go on. Go now. Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed his kit and hurried to the green room. Inside, the four musicians, the City Symphony's finest, stood in a semicircle around a spreading dark stain on the cream-colored carpet. Oh, thank God, the first violinist said, clutching a case to his chest. We're afraid to move. My instrument is a guarneri. If a drop of that wine touches the wood. I've got it, sir, Elias said quietly. He knelt, his movements efficient and practiced. He worked with a surgical precision, absorbing the liquid with specialized cloths, ensuring not a single drop splattered toward the precious instruments. As he worked, his eyes wandered to the table nearby. A stack of sheet music lay open. It was Mozart's String Quartet No. 19, The Dissonance. Elias's eyes instinctively tracked the first violin part, his mind hearing the tension of the opening C major chords against the jarring chromatics. You read music? The cellist asked, noticing Elias's fixed gaze. Elias froze, a damp cloth in his hand. He looked up, then quickly looked back. Down at the floor. A little, sir. A little. The violinist laughed, though not unkindly. Most people look at this and see bird droppings. You play. Used to, Elias whispered. A long time ago. What instrument? Elias hesitated. The word felt heavy, like a secret he wasn't supposed to keep. Piano. The musicians exchanged a look. There was a weight in Elias's voice, a hollow resonance that spoke of a history far deeper than his olive coveralls suggested. Well, if you still have the itch, we do free rehearsals on Sunday afternoons. The cellist offered. It's good for the soul. Thank you, Elias said, gathering his supplies. That's very kind. He left the room quickly. Kindness from people in this building felt like a garment that no longer fit him, itchy and uncomfortable. He returned to his post. In the main hall, just as the dessert service began, Arthur Langford was holding court at the center table, his voice loud with the confidence of 3 glasses of vintage Bordeaux. He was regaling a group of developers with his plans for a new luxury high-rise that would displace a historic working-class neighborhood, the very neighborhood where Elias lived. The problem with these areas, Langford said, gesturing with a gold-plated dessert fork, is that the people there simply have no appreciation for culture. They wouldn't know real art if it walked up and introduced itself. Speaking of which, interjected a younger man, a protege of Langford's named Marcus. I heard a hilarious rumor from the green room just now. Apparently one of the janitors claims he's a conservatory-trained pianist. Can you imagine? The table erupted in laughter. Elias, standing 30 feet away in the shadows, felt the blood drain from his face. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Which one? Langford asked, his eyes scanning the room with predatory delight. I want to see this maestro of the mop. The one by the service door, I think, Marcus said, pointing. Langford's gaze locked onto Elias. You there? Maintenance. Come here. The room went silent. 200 pairs of eyes, heavy with the weight of millions, turned toward the man in the olive coveralls. Elias felt the vastness of the hall shrinking, the marble floor turning into quicksand. He walked slowly toward the head table, each footstep echoing like a drumbeat in the quiet. "Are you the one?" Langford asked, his tone dripping with mock curiosity. "Are you the hidden genius of the Grand Overture Hall?" Elias stood straight, his hands clasped behind his back to hide their shaking. "I used to play, sir. Many years ago." "Used to play?" Langford turned to the room, his arms spread wide. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are in the presence of greatness. Our very own janitor used to play the piano. Tell us, where did you receive this world-class education? The University of Scrub and Bucket?" The laughter that followed was sharp. It wasn't the laughter of a shared joke. It was the laughter of the superior witnessing the absurd. "The New England Conservatory, sir," Elias said, his voice low but clear. The laughter died instantly. A heavy, awkward silence descended. Langford blinked, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second before returning, wider and more vicious than before. "The New England Conservatory? Well, this is better than I imagined. A conservatory-trained pianist who chose the life of a janitor. There must be a tragic story there. What happened, Elias? Failed your juries? Couldn't handle the pressure of the real stage?" Elias said nothing. He thought of Elena. He thought of the night the rain looked just like this, and the sound of the tires screeching on the wet pavement. He thought of the medical bills that had piled up like snowdrifts. "Cat got your tongue?" Langford pressed, leaning in. "Or perhaps you're lying. Perhaps you've been telling tall tales to make yourself feel less invisible." "I am not lying, sir." "Prove it." The challenge hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Langford gestured grandly toward the Steinway on the stage. "There is a $2 million instrument sitting right there. Play something for us, Maestro Thorne. Unless, of course, you'd like to admit right now that you're nothing more than a man with a mop and a very active imagination." Sarah, the coordinator, stepped forward, her face etched with worry. "Mr. Langford, I don't think this is appropriate." "Nonsense," Langford barked. "This is the most entertainment we've had all night. Play, janitor. Show us what a conservatory education gets you these days. Maybe chopsticks. I'm sure that's about your speed." Elias looked at the piano. Then he looked at Langford. In that moment, he didn't see a billionaire. He saw every dismissive glance he had endured for 5 years. He saw every person who had looked through him as if he were glass. He saw the world that had told him his sacrifice was a sign of failure rather than love. "What would you like to hear, sir?" Elias asked quietly. A murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd. Phones were pulled from tuxedo pockets, cameras aimed at the stage in anticipation of a spectacular humiliation. "Dealer's choice," Langford laughed, sitting back and crossing his legs. "Whatever you think you can manage." Elias walked toward the stage. His work boots felt heavy on the plush carpet, a jarring contrast to the elegance of the room. He ascended the stairs, the stage lights blindingly bright. He approached the Steinway. The lid was open, a yawning mouth of black lacquer and gold. He sat on the bench. The wood felt familiar, a ghost of a previous life. He looked down at the 88 keys, the same 88 keys that had once been his entire world. The last time he had sat at a piano like this, Elena had been in the front row. She had been 8 months pregnant, her eyes shining with a pride that made him feel invincible. "Play like you're telling our daughter a story," she had whispered to him before he went on. 2 weeks later, she was gone. Elias placed his hands on the ivory. His fingers were thick, his knuckles swollen from labor, but as they touched the keys, something happened. The calluses didn't matter. The olive coveralls didn't matter. The mockery of the 200 millionaires didn't matter. He didn't play chopsticks. He began with the first movement of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. The opening chords rang out like a series of heavy bells, dark and ominous, building in intensity with a power that seemed to vibrate the very foundations of the hall. The room fell into a deathly silence. The mocking smiles froze. The phones that had been raised to record a joke remained raised, but the hands holding them began to tremble. Elias wasn't just playing, he was exorcising. Every hour of mopping, every night, of worrying about rent. Every ounce of grief he had suppressed for Maya's sake came pouring out through his fingertips. The music was a storm of violent, beautiful upheaval of sound that filled every corner of the Grand Overture Hall. He transitioned seamlessly into the furious, cascading runs of the Allegro. His hands moved with a fluid, terrifying precision that defied his appearance. He was no longer a janitor. He was a force of nature. In the audience, Arthur Langford slumped back in his chair, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Sarah stood in the wings, tears streaming down her face, her clipboard forgotten on the floor. Elias moved into the second movement, the Adagio. This was for Elena. The melody was a fragile, aching thing, a song of moonlight and missed opportunities. It was the sound of a man whispering to a memory. The notes floated through the hall like ghosts, and for the first time in its history, the wealthy patrons of the Grand Overture Hall forgot to breathe. He didn't stop there. He pushed into Liszt's La Campanella, the bell like high notes, singing with a clarity that seemed impossible. His fingers flew across the keyboard in a display of technical mastery that few professional pianists could hope to replicate. He was showing them what they had ignored. He was showing them the culture they claimed to own, but which he had lived. Finally, he closed with an improvisation of his own, a piece he had started writing in the conservatory and finished in his mind while scrubbing the floors of the very stage he now sat upon. It was a piece of grit and grace, of shadows and light. When the final, thunderous chord finally died away, the silence that followed was absolute. It lasted for 5 seconds, 10, 15. Elias sat with his head bowed, his chest heaving, sweat dripping from his forehead onto the black lacquer of the Steinway. Then, the explosion happened. It wasn't just applause, it was a roar. 200 people, the coldest hearts in the city, rose to their feet as one. They weren't clapping for a janitor. They were clapping for a master. Elias stood slowly. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Arthur Langford. The billionaire was standing, but he wasn't clapping. He was staring at Elias with a look of profound, shattered shock. Elias didn't take a bow. He simply walked off the stage, down the stairs, and back toward his mop bucket. He had a hall to clean, and the echoes of a hidden life had finally found their voice. Maya would be proud. The story had only just begun. The roar of the 200 guests did not feel like a triumph to Elias Thorne. It felt like a tidal wave threatening to pull him out to a sea he had spent 5 years trying to escape. As he stepped down from the stage, his work boots thudding softly against the carpeted stairs, the air in the Grand Overture Hall felt different. It was thicker, charged with a sudden, frantic electricity. The silence he had inhabited for half a decade, the safety of being a shadow, had been obliterated by a single, desperate act of artistic defiance. He did not look at the faces in the front row. He did not look at the flashing lights of the smartphones or the women dabbing their eyes with silk handkerchiefs. He looked only at his mop bucket, standing lonely and utilitarian by the service door. It was his anchor, a reminder of the life he had chosen so that Maya could have a future. Elias, wait. The voice was Sarah's. The event coordinator reached him before he could slip back into the darkness of the service corridor. Her face was flushed, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. She reached out to touch his arm, but pulled back at the last second, as if unsure whether she was allowed to touch a man who could summon such power from a piece of wood and wire. That was, I don't even have words, she stammered. Elias, he's coming this way. Elias turned. Arthur Langford was indeed approaching, his stride less certain than it had been 10 minutes ago. The silver-haired mogul looked as though he had been struck by lightning and was still trying to decide if he was dead or merely transformed. Behind him, the crowd was beginning to swell toward the stage, a low murmur of, "Who is he? And did you hear that?" rising like a Gregorian chant. Langford stopped 3 feet from Elias. The predatory glint in his eyes had been replaced by a hollow, stunned vacancy. He looked at Elias's hands, the hands he had mocked just moments before, and then up at his face. For the first time, Langford seemed to see the lines of exhaustion and the quiet dignity that Elias had worn like a cloak. You, Langford said, his voice unusually quiet, stripped of its practiced boom. You really are from the conservatory. I told you I was, sir, Elias replied. His voice was steady, but his heart was a drum in his chest. I have no reason to lie about the things I've lost. Langford opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to offer a hollow compliment. But he was interrupted by Marcus, the young protege who had ignited the fire. Marcus looked pale, his previous arrogance curdled into a visible, shivering embarrassment. Arthur, the guests, they're asking for him, Marcus whispered, though his eyes never left Elias. They want to know why a man like that is, a janitor? Elias finished for him. The word didn't taste bitter anymore. It tasted like a shield. I am a janitor because my daughter's insulin costs more than a pianist's dreams, Marcus. I am a janitor because the world doesn't pay for Rachmaninoff. It pays for clean floors. A woman in a gown of midnight blue pushed past Marcus. She was one of the city's most prominent philanthropists, a woman known for her icy composure. Now her eyes were red-rimmed. Sir, she said, her voice trembling. I have heard the greatest virtuosos of the age. I have heard them in London, in Paris, in Vienna. But I have never heard anyone play with such grief. Who are you? I'm the man who cleans the restrooms on the 3rd floor, ma'am, Elias said, bowing his head slightly. And if you'll excuse me, I still have work to do. He didn't wait for a rebuttal. He grabbed the handle of his mop bucket and pushed it through the service door, the squeak of the wheels sounding like a frantic cry in the sudden silence of the hall. He vanished into the labyrinth of the backstage corridors, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He needed to get out. He needed the rain. He needed the anonymity of the city. He reached the staff locker room, a windowless bunker that smelled of industrial soap and old coffee. He sat on a wooden bench, his head in his hands. His fingers were still tingling, the phantom vibrations of the Steinway's bass notes echoing in his marrow. He had broken the rule. He had let them in. He had shown the world the one part of himself he had sworn to keep in the box with Elena's memory. A soft knock on the locker room door startled him. It was the cellist from the string quartet, still in his formal black attire, carrying his instrument case. I thought I might find you here, the musician said, leaning against the doorframe. He didn't look at Elias with pity, but with the profound respect of a fellow soldier who had seen a comrade perform a miracle on the battlefield. That was the most beautiful thing I've heard in 20 years of playing. You didn't just play those notes, man. You bled them. I shouldn't have done it, Elias whispered. Why? Because they didn't deserve it. The cellist walked into the room and sat on the bench opposite him. Maybe they didn't, but you deserve to hear yourself again. And I think the piano needed it, too. That Steinway has been bored to death by hacks for years. You gave it its soul back. The cellist reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, cream-colored envelope. One of the guests, a woman in the 3rd row, asked me to give this to you. She didn't want to cause a scene by coming back here. She said you'd know what it meant. Elias took the envelope. It was heavy, the paper textured and expensive. There was no name on the front, only a seal in red wax, a crest he recognized with a jolt of recognition that made his stomach turn. It was the seal of the New England Conservatory's Emeritus Board. Who was she? Elias asked, his voice cracking. I don't know, the cellist said, standing up. But she looked like she'd seen a ghost. Get home safe, Elias. And for God's sake, don't stop. Don't let the mop be the last thing your hands remember. When the cellist left, Elias sat in the fluorescent hum of the locker room and opened the envelope. Inside was a single piece of heavy cardstock. There was no long letter, no sprawling explanation. Only a few lines written in a sharp, elegant hand that Elias knew all too well. Elias, I was told you had disappeared into the shadows of the city. I was told you had given up the ghost. But tonight, I heard the story you were telling. I heard the promise you made to Elena, and I heard the pain of the years since. The world thinks you are a janitor, but the music knows better. You cannot hide a fire of that magnitude under a coverall forever. The Grand Overture Hall is a tomb for the living, Elias. Do not let them turn you into an exhibit. Tomorrow morning, at 10 o'clock, come to the old chapel. On 4th Street. Bring your hands. Bring your heart. We are not done. NV. Elias stared at the initials. NV Natasha Volkov, the widow of the legendary Mikhail Volkov, and the woman who had been his mentor before the accident. She was the most formidable woman in the world of classical music, a woman who had seen the rise and fall of 100 maestros. She had been in the audience. She had seen him in his olive coveralls. He tucked the note into his pocket, his hand trembling. The assumptions of the room had been shattered. They thought he was a failed dream, a curiosity to be gawked at. But Natasha, she had seen the truth. She hadn't seen a janitor playing piano. She had seen a pianist waiting to be reborn. He changed out of his coveralls and into his worn flannel shirt and jeans. He clocked out, his hand hovering over the time card. He felt like he was signing a confession. As he stepped out the service entrance, the September rain hit him, cool and indifferent. The city was a blur of neon and gray as he walked toward the subway. His mind was a storm. He thought of Maya, sleeping in their small apartment, dreaming of a father who was just a man who worked hard. He thought of the $2 million Steinway and the way the C-sharp had sounded in the adagio. Perfect, crystalline, like a tear falling into a pool of still water. On the train, a teenager sitting across from him was scrolling through his phone. Elias caught a glimpse of the screen. A video was playing, grainy, shaky, filmed from a low angle. It was the Grand Overture Hall. It was the stage. It was him. The video already had thousands of views. The caption read, "Unbelievable. Janitor stuns millionaires at gala." You have to hear this. Elias looked away, his stomach twisting. It was happening. The invisibility he had cultivated, the silence that had protected his small, fragile life with Maya, was being stripped away. The world was reaching for him, not with a helping hand, but with the hungry curiosity of a crowd watching a spectacle. He reached his apartment at midnight. The hallways smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wood. He unlocked the door to his home, the 3 deadbolts clicking in the silence. He moved through the small living room, careful not to wake Mrs. Gable, the elderly neighbor who watched Maya in exchange for Elias fixing her plumbing and hauling her groceries. He went to Maya's bedside. She was 7 now, her dark hair splayed across the pillow, her breathing deep and rhythmic. On her nightstand sat a small, plastic keyboard he had bought her for her birthday, a cheap thing with tinny sound and neon buttons. She loved it. She played it every day, unaware that her father's hands were capable of conjuring thunder. Elias sat on the edge of her bed, the note from Natasha Volkov heavy in his pocket. He thought of the assumptions everyone had made tonight. Langford had assumed he was nothing. The crowd had assumed he was a miracle. Natasha assumed he was ready to come back. But Elias knew the truth. He was a man who loved his daughter more than he loved the air he breathed. And if the world found out who he was, if the spotlight stayed on him, the life he had built, the quiet, safe, invisible life, would be burned to the ground. He looked at his hands in the dim light of the street lamp outside the window. They were the hands of a janitor. They were the hands of a father. They were the hands of a man who had just shattered the peace of his own life with a single, perfect note. He lay down on the small cot in the corner of the room, but sleep did not come. He could still hear the Rachmaninoff. He could still see the red wax seal on the envelope. The note had shattered the assumptions of the room, but it had also shattered the walls Elias had built around his heart. Tomorrow, he would have to decide if he was brave enough to be seen. He would have to decide if Elias Thorne was ready to stop mopping up the shadows and start stepping into the light. As the rain continued to drum against the glass, Elias reached out and touched the keys of Maya's plastic keyboard. He didn't press them. He just let his fingers rest there, a bridge between the world he had left and the world that was now demanding his return. The echoes of his hidden life were no longer echoes. They were a symphony, and the conductor was waiting. The sun that rose the next morning did not bring the warmth of a new beginning. It brought the harsh, unforgiving light of exposure. Elias Thorne woke before his alarm, his body aching not from the labor of the previous day, but from the spiritual exhaustion of the previous night. He lay on his narrow cot, staring at the cracked plaster of the ceiling, listening to the city begin its restless morning hum. Beside him, Maya was still curled in her blankets. This was the moment Elias lived for, and the moment he dreaded most, the morning ritual. He sat up, his joints popping, and reached for the small medical kit on the nightstand. Survival had a very specific sound. It was the soft click of a plastic case opening. It was the sharp, metallic snap of a sterile needle being uncapped. It was the silence of a father's breath as he checked the blood sugar levels of his only child. Maya stirred as he pricked her finger. She didn't cry. She was used to the sting. At 7 years old, she understood the mechanics of her own survival better than most adults understood their own hearts. "Is it a good number, Daddy?" she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. "It's a perfect number, Maya." Elias lied, though the reading was slightly higher than he liked. He adjusted the insulin dosage, his hands steady despite the turmoil in his mind. The cost of this small vial of clear liquid was 3 days of back-breaking labor at the Grand Overture Hall. It was the rent he skipped, the meals he minimized, the dreams he had buried in that cardboard box. To the people in the gilded hall, music was an ornament, a jewel to be worn at a gala. To Elias, silence was the currency he used to buy his daughter's life. After he had settled Maya with Mrs. Gable and a bowl of oatmeal, Elias stepped out into the hallway. He felt a strange prickle on the back of his neck, a sense of being watched. As he descended the stairs, he saw Mr. Henderson, the building superintendent, looking at his phone and then looking up at Elias with a squint of disbelief. "Thorne," Henderson called out, holding up the screen. "Is this you?" Some guy in a janitor suit playing like a goddamn maniac at the Overture Hall. Elias didn't stop. "I just do my job, Henderson." "The hell you do? This thing has 500,000 views. People are calling you the Phantom of the Mob. You're famous, man." Famous. The word felt like a threat. In Elias's world, fame brought scrutiny, and scrutiny brought the end of safety. If the management at the hall decided he was a distraction, if the donors felt uncomfortable being serviced by a man who made them feel emotionally inferior, he would lose his job. And if he lost his job, he lost the insurance. If he lost the insurance, Maya lost her breath. He walked toward 4th Street, his hood pulled low against a lingering drizzle. The old chapel sat between a boarded-up warehouse and a modern glass luxury complex, a relic of a different era, much like Natasha Volkov herself. The doors were heavy oak, scarred by time. As Elias pushed them open, the smell of beeswax, old paper, and damp stone enveloped him. The acoustics of the chapel were legendary. The high vaulted ceilings were designed to carry a whisper to the ears of God. At the far end of the nave, near the altar, sat a weathered Steinway upright. It wasn't the 9-foot beast of the Overture Hall, but it had the soul of 1,000 rehearsals etched into its keys. And standing beside it, as straight and sharp as a silver blade, was Natasha Volkov. She was nearly 80, her white hair pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to pull the skin of her face into a permanent expression of focused intensity. She wore a black wool coat and held a cane she didn't seem to need. "You're 3 minutes late, Elias," she said, her voice echoing like a strike-on a chime. "I had to walk. I didn't want to take the bus," Elias said, stopping 10 feet away. "You're afraid of the glowing rectangles in everyone's hands," Natasha said, her eyes boring into him. "You're afraid that if the world sees you, they will take what little you have left." "They will," Elias said. "You know how they are, Natasha. They want a story. They want a tragedy they can applaud and then forget. I can't afford to be there." "Tragedy. Sit," she commanded, gesturing to the piano bench. Elias approached the instrument with the caution of a man approaching an unexploded bomb. He sat. The wood was cold. "Play the Chopin Ballade No. 1, she said. "The G minor. Play the part where the light fails." Elias hesitated. "My hands are stiff. I was mopping the grand staircase until midnight." "Your hands are not the problem, Elias. Your soul is stiff. It has been cramped in a box for too long. Play." He began. The opening was tentative, the octaves lacking the thunderous authority they had possessed the night before. Without the adrenaline of the gala, without the blinding light of Langford's cruelty to push him, Elias felt the weight of his reality. He felt the hunger in his stomach, the worry for Maya's insulin supply, the fear of Henderson's prying eyes. The music faltered. He hit a jarring wrong note in the middle of a cascading run and stopped, his hands trembling on the ivory. "I can't do this," he whispered. "The cost is too high." Natasha walked over, her cane clicking on the stone floor. She didn't offer a comforting hand. She stood over him like a judge. "What is the cost, Elias? Tell me exactly what you are paying." "Everything," Elias shouted, the sound bouncing off the vaulted ceiling. "If I play, I am seen. If I am seen, I am a maestro. But a maestro doesn't have a union contract. A maestro doesn't have a health plan that covers a 7-year-old's type 1 diabetes. Langford and his board, they think I'm a miracle today, but tomorrow, I'm the man who made them look like fools. They'll find a reason to let me go. They'll hire a professional cleaning service. And then what? Do I pay for Maya's medicine with applause?" Natasha was silent for a long time. The shadows of the chapel seemed to lengthen around them. "My Mikhail died in a hospital in Moscow," she said softly. "He was the greatest pianist of the Soviet Union. He had all the medals, all the glory. But when he fell ill, the state decided he was no longer a useful asset. They moved him to a ward with no heat. I sold my wedding ring to buy him a blanket. I sold his sheet music to buy him soup." She looked down at Elias. "Survival is always high-priced, Elias. But you are making a mistake. You think that by hiding, you are protecting Maya. But you are teaching her that her father is a ghost. You are teaching her that the world is a place where beauty must be traded for bread. I am keeping her alive. You are keeping her breathing. There is a difference." She reached into her coat and pulled out a newspaper. It was the city's main daily. On the front of the arts section was a still frame from the viral video. "The Maestro of the Shadows," the headline read. "Langford called me this morning," Natasha said. "He was humiliated, yes. But he is also a businessman. He wants to offer you a position, a residency, a salary. That would triple what you earn now." Elias felt a surge of hope, followed immediately by a cold, crushing wave of cynicism. "And the catch? He owns me. I play when he rings the bell. I become the janitor pianist, a circus act for his donor parties." "The catch is that you have to be Elias Thorne again," Natasha said. "You have to accept that you are not a man who cleans. You are a man who plays, who happens to have cleaned." "I can't take the risk," Elias said, standing up. "I have to go to work. I have a shift at 2. There's a matinee performance of the Nutcracker. The kids spill popcorn. It takes hours to get out of the velvet." "Elias," she called as he walked toward the doors. "The music didn't shatter the assumptions of the room last night. It shattered you. You can't go back to the mop and pretend your heart isn't beating in 3/4 time." Elias didn't look back. He pushed through the oak doors and back into the gray drizzle of the city. When he arrived at the Grand Overture Hall, the atmosphere was unrecognizable. The security guards, men he had shared silent nods with for years, stared at him. One of them, a burly man named Dave, actually opened the door for him. "Hell of a show, Elias," Dave said, his voice hesitant. "My wife cried when she saw the video. She didn't know you had it in you." "Thanks, Dave," Elias said, keeping his eyes on the floor. He went to the locker room, but his locker had been broken into. Not to steal his things, but to leave them. There were flowers. There were dozens of notes from staff members, and there was a formal, heavy envelope taped to the metal door. He opened it. It was from Arthur Langford's office. "Mr. Thorne, please report to the boardroom at 3 p.m. Do not worry about your shift. Your duties have been covered." Elias felt a cold sweat break out. Duties have been covered. It was the corporate euphemism for "you're finished." He spent the next hour in a daze, clutching his cleaning supplies in the utility closet, sitting on a crate of industrial bleach. The smell of the chemicals, which usually grounded him, now felt like the scent of an ending. At 3 p.m., he walked to the top floor. The boardroom was a masterpiece of mahogany and glass, overlooking the city skyline. Arthur Langford sat at the head of the table. He wasn't alone. There were 5 other board members, and Sarah, the event coordinator, who looked like she hadn't slept. Langford didn't look angry. He looked calculated. "Sit down, Elias," Langford said, indicating a chair that cost more than Elias's. Car. Elias remained standing. He was still in his olive coveralls. He felt the contrast like a physical weight. Am I being fired, Mr. Langford? Fired? Langford laughed, but it was a dry, joyless sound. Elias, you are the most famous thing to happen to this hall in a decade. We've had 3 million views on that video. The New York Times is calling. Carnegie Hall is calling. If I fired you, the public would burn this building down. Langford leaned forward, his hands clasped. We want to offer you a contract. A 1-year residency. You will perform for solo recitals. You will be our cultural ambassador. We will pay you a stipend of $80,000, plus full benefits. The best health plan we have. Elias's heart skipped. 80,000. Full benefits. It was the answer to every prayer he had ever whispered into the dark. It was Maya's insulin. It was a new apartment. It was a life without the mop. But he looked at Langford's eyes. There was no love for music there. There was only the hunger of a man who had found a new way to market a product. And my title? Elias asked. Langford smiled. The Janitor Pianist. We've already trademarked it. We're thinking of a documentary. From the mop to the Mozart. It's a goldmine, Elias. The public loves a rags to riches story. The high cost of survival. Elias looked at his hands. He thought of Natasha's warning. Do not let them turn you into an exhibit. If he took this deal, he would be safe. Maya would be safe. But he would be a caricature. He would be the man who played for the people who had mocked him, wearing his coveralls like a costume, performing his grief for their entertainment. He would be trading his dignity for his daughter's life. It was the ultimate bargain. It was the exact price of survival. I need to think about it, Elias said, his voice hollow. Don't think too long, Langford said, his tone sharpening. The internet has a short memory. Today you're a miracle. Tomorrow, you're just a man who didn't take the chance when it was offered. Elias walked out of the boardroom. He didn't go to the locker room. He went to the main hall. It was empty now, the stage set for the afternoon matinee. He stood in the back, in the shadows where he belonged. He thought of the music he had played the night before. It had been the only honest thing he had done in years. And now, the world wanted to take that honesty and wrap it in a marketing campaign. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Mrs. Gable. Elias, Maya's sugar is spiking. I'm worried. I think we need the fast-acting dose, but the pharmacy said the prescription is expired. You need to come home. Elias felt the world tilt. The prescription. He had forgotten to renew it. Because he had been so caught up in the aftermath of the gala. He didn't have the money for the emergency walk-in clinic without the insurance authorization, which usually took 24 hours to process. He looked back toward the boardroom elevator. He looked at the stage. He realized then that he didn't have the luxury of dignity. He didn't have the right to be an artist. He was a father in a world that charged a premium for the right to breathe. He turned toward the elevator. He was going to sign the contract. He was going to become the Janitor Pianist. He was going to be an exhibit, a joke, a miracle, whatever they wanted him to be. Because the high cost of survival wasn't just the work. It was the slow, methodical surrender of the man he was, in exchange for the life of the girl he loved. He reached the boardroom door and pushed it open. Langford looked up, a knowing smirk on his face. I'll sign, Elias said, his voice dead. But I want the insurance active today, right now. Consider it done, maestro, Langford said. Elias Thorne took the pen. As he signed his name, he felt the music inside him go silent. He had saved Maya. But as the ink dried on the expensive paper, he knew he had just mopped up the last remains of his soul. The first few weeks of Elias Thorne's residency were not spent in front of a keyboard, but in front of cameras. The marketing machine of the Grand Overture Hall, fueled by Arthur Langford's mercenary instincts, moved with the terrifying efficiency of a steamroller. Elias was no longer the invisible man in the shadows. He was a brand. More grit, Elias. Lean on the mop. Look at the keys like you're dreaming of a world you can't reach, the photographer barked. Elias stood on the stage of the main hall, dressed in a brand new pair of olive coveralls. They were made of high-quality cotton, perfectly tailored, and artificially distressed with paint and sandpaper to look authentic. It was a costume. He felt like a marionette, his strings held by a PR team that viewed his 5 years of agonizing sacrifice as nothing more than a compelling backstory. "This is perfect," Langford said, standing behind the camera crew, sipping an espresso. The janitor pianist, the man who found heaven in a bucket of gray water. "The public is eating it up, Elias. The first recital is sold out. We've had to add a second date." Elias said nothing. He looked at the Steinway. It felt distant, like a former lover who no longer recognized him. Every time he sat at the keys now, he felt the weight of the contract. He wasn't playing for Elena's memory anymore. He wasn't playing to tell Maya a story. He was playing to fulfill a brand promise. The high cost of survival had moved from his wallet to his bones. At home, the transformation was visible in a different way. The refrigerator was full. The cramped apartment was stocked with the highest grade of fast-acting insulin. Maya had new shoes, and Mrs. Gable had been paid 3 months in advance. Physically, the Thorne household was thriving. But Maya was observant. She sat on the floor one evening, watching Elias practice on the cheap plastic keyboard. He was running through the flashy, light-hearted pieces Langford had demanded for the first half of the recital, lists more acrobatic etudes, pieces designed to make the audience gasp at his untrained speed. "You sound like you're hitting the keys, Daddy," Maya said, her head tilted. "Not playing them." Elias stopped, his fingers hovering over the plastic buttons. "It's just practice, Maya. I'm tired. When you played at the big hall, the video on the computer, it sounded like you were crying," she said softly. "Now it sounds like you're just working. Like when you used to scrub the floors." Elias looked at his daughter. Her words were a scalpel, cutting through the layers of artifice he had allowed Langford to build around him. She was right. He had traded the physical labor of the mop for the spiritual labor of the gimmick. He was still a janitor. He was just cleaning up Langford's balance sheets instead of his marble floors. The next morning, Elias didn't go to the hall for his scheduled personality coaching session. Instead, he went to the old chapel on 4th Street. Natasha Volkov was there, as she always was, sitting in a pew, reading a score. She didn't look up when he entered. "I saw the posters, Elias," she said, her voice dry. "The janitor pianist. You look very handsome in your designer rags." "It's paying for the medicine, Natasha," Elias said, sliding into the pew behind her. "Yes, it is paying for the body. But what are you feeding the soul?" She finally turned to look at him. Her eyes were sharp, unforgiving. "I watched you in the rehearsal room yesterday through the glass. You were playing the campanella. Technically, it was perfect. Spiritually, it was a desert. You are letting them turn your talent into a trick. You are letting them win. I have no choice. I signed the paper." "You signed a paper that says you will play. It does not say you must play like a coward." She stood up, her cane striking the stone floor with a sharp clack. "Langford thinks he owns the maestro. But the maestro lives in a place no contract can reach. You have forgotten why you touched the keys that night at the gala. You didn't do it to get a residency. You did it because you couldn't. Be silent for one more second." She leaned in, her face inches from his. "The first recital is in 3 days. The world is coming to see a janitor. Are you going to give them a janitor, Elias? Or are you going to give them a man who has walked through fire?" Elias left the chapel with his head spinning. As he walked through the city, he saw his own face on a bus stop advertisement. The janitor pianist, a miracle in the dark. He felt a surge of visceral loathing. He didn't return to the hall. He went to the park and sat on a bench for hours, watching the winter wind whip through the trees. He thought of the New England Conservatory. He thought of the years he had spent studying the architecture of Bach, the raw, bleeding emotions of Rachmaninoff. He had spent his life trying to understand the truth of music. And now he was a lie. The night of the first official recital arrived. The Grand Overture Hall was a sea of black ties and silk. But there was a new element in the crowd, ordinary people, students, and workers who had been moved by the viral video. They were there for the miracle. Backstage, the tension was suffocating. Langford entered the dressing room, looking triumphant. "All right, Elias. Here's the plan. You go out in the coveralls. Start with the chopsticks improvisation we practiced. Make it look like you're just discovering the piano. Then move into the list. We want the wow factor. The Cameras are rolling for the documentary. Elias looked at the tailored, distressed coveralls hanging on the door. He looked at the mop that had been placed in the corner of the dressing room as a prop for his entrance. No, Elias said. Langford paused, his smile flickering. Excuse me. I'm not wearing those, Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. And I'm not bringing the mop. Elias, don't be difficult. This is the brand. People paid to see the janitor. Pianist. If you go out there in a tuxedo, the magic is gone. You're just another guy who went to a conservatory. The story dies. The story is that I am a man, Elias said, standing up. A man who suffered. And a man who loves his daughter. The mop isn't the story, Arthur. The mop was the cage. Listen to me, you ungrateful. Langford started, stepping into Elias's space. I saved your daughter's life. I paid for that medicine. You owe me. I owe you my work, Elias said. I do not owe you my dignity. Elias walked to the wardrobe. He didn't put on the coveralls. He had brought his own clothes, a simple, clean black shirt and black trousers. No gimmicks. No rags. If you do this, Langford hissed, I will make sure the janitor label follows. You like a curse. I will pull the marketing. I'll make you a one-hit wonder who couldn't handle the spotlight. Then let it follow me, Elias said. But at least I'll be standing on my own feet. He didn't wait for Langford's response. He walked toward the wings. He could hear the low hum of the sold-out crowd. He felt a terrifying, exhilarating clarity. He was reclaiming the maestro within. The lights in the hall dimmed. The announcer's voice boomed over the speakers. Introducing the janitor pianist. Elias stepped onto the stage. A confused murmur swept through the audience. They were expecting the man from the video, the laborer in the olive rags. Instead, they saw a man in black, walking with a steady, purposeful gait. He looked like a titan. He looked like he belonged to the stage, not the shadows. Elias sat at the Steinway. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't look at Langford, who was fuming in the wings. He looked at Maya, who was sitting in the front row with Mrs. Gable, her eyes wide and bright. He didn't play the flashy list. He didn't play the chopsticks improvisation. He began with Beethoven's Appassionata, Sonata number 23 in F minor. From the first three notes, the low, brooding F minor chord, the atmosphere in the hall shifted. This was not a trick. This was not a miracle. This was the sound of a man who had mastered the language of human suffering. The Appassionata is a beast of a piece. It is a sonata of extreme violence and extreme beauty. Elias played the opening allegro with a visceral power that seemed to shake the chandeliers. He wasn't playing for Langford's documentary. He was playing for the 5 years he had been silent. He was playing for every floor he had scrubbed, every insult he had swallowed, every night he had spent, fearing for Maya's next breath. In the wings, Langford was red-faced, whispering furiously into his headset too. The camera crews. Get close-ups of his hands. We can still sell this as the refined janitor. But as the music progressed into the second movement, the andante, the gimmicks, became irrelevant. Elias played the variations with a profound, spiritual grace. The music was no longer about his backstory. It was about the music itself. The audience, which had come for a spectacle, found themselves confronted by something they hadn't expected, art. By the time Elias reached the final, tempestuous allegro, the hall was paralyzed. He was no longer the janitor. He was Elias Thorne, a maestro of the highest order. His fingers flew across the ivory with a clarity and a ferocity that surpassed anything he had done at the gala. He wasn't just reclaiming his career. He was reclaiming his identity. He was showing the world that you could strip a man of his clothes, his title, and his money, but if he held on to his soul, he was still a king. When the final chord crashed through the hall, there was no immediate applause. There was only a collective, stunned gasp. Then, slowly, the entire audience rose. It wasn't the polite standing ovation of a gala. It was a visceral, emotional release. Elias stood. He looked at the audience. He didn't bow like a servant. He stood, tall, acknowledging the music. In the back of the hall, Natasha Volkov stood, her eyes moist. She gave a single, sharp nod. The maestro had returned. Elias walked off the stage. Langford tried to intercept him, his face a mask of calculated fury. You ruined the branding, Elias. The janitor, Hook, is dead. How am I supposed to sell this now? Elias stopped and looked Langford in the eye. For the first time, Langford looked small. Sell it as music, Arthur, Elias said quietly. If that's not enough for you, then you never deserved to hear it in the first place. Elias didn't wait for his check. He didn't wait for the reviews. He walked straight to the front row, picked up Maya, and carried her out of the hall. As they stepped into the cold night air, Maya whispered into his ear. That sounded like the real story, Daddy. It was, Maya, Elias said, looking at the city lights. It was. He was still survival-bound, still tied to a contract, still a man with a sick daughter in an expensive world. But as he walked away from the Grand Overture Hall, Elias Thorne knew that he was no longer a ghost mopping up the shadows. He was the light itself. The janitor was dead. The maestro was finally home. The morning after the recital, the city's newspapers did not carry the image. Arthur Langford had spent thousands to cure it. There was no photo of a man in distressed coveralls leaning against a mop. Instead, the front page of the arts section featured a stark, powerful silhouette of Elias Thorne in simple black, his hands poised over the keys like a predator or a priest. The headline in the Daily Chronicle was a single word: visible. The fallout was immediate and chaotic. Arthur Langford's office was flooded with calls, but they weren't from circus watchers looking for a gimmick. They were from the London Philharmonic, the Berlin State Opera, and the Recording Academy. The public had seen through the janitor pianist branding and found something far more dangerous to the status quo, a master who refused to be a servant. Elias sat in his new apartment, a modest but sun-drenched space near the park that the residency salary had finally secured, and watched the steam rise from his coffee. For the first time in 5 years, the air in his home didn't smell of dampness or despair. It smelled of cedar and floor wax. Yes, but also of the sheet music spread across the dining table. Maya was at the new school, a place with a full-time nurse and a music program. The cost of her survival was no longer a daily miracle. It was a settled fact. But as Elias looked at his hands, he felt a strange, lingering weight. He was no longer invisible, but he was not yet free. A knock at the door revealed Natasha Volkov. She didn't wait for an invitation. Stepping inside and tapping her cane against the hardwood. The reviews are calling you a revolutionary, Elias, she said, her voice crackling with dry humor. They say you have dismantled the barriers of the concert hall. Langford is in his office, I am told, throwing crystal tumblers at the wall because he cannot figure out how to sue a man for being too good. He still has the contract, Natasha, Elias said, leaning back. He still owns the next 3 recitals. He's already sending memos about pivoting the brand to the refined titan. He wants me to play a gala for a group of venture capitalists next week. And will you? Elias looked out the window. I realized something last night, Natasha. When I walked off that stage, I looked at the people who had come to see the janitor. They weren't just billionaires. There were people there who looked like I did a month ago. Tired, dusty. People who had spent their last $20 to see someone like them find a way out of the dark. I can't just play for the Langfords of the world anymore. It would be a different kind of mopping up. Then do not play for them, Natasha said. The contract says you must perform in the Grand Overture Hall. It does not say who must be in the seats. Elias's eyes sharpened. A slow, deliberate smile spread across his face. Visibility, he whispered. It shouldn't just be for me. The following week was a war of nerves. Langford tried to exert control, demanding rehearsals and wardrobe checks, but Elias ignored the memos. He spent his days not in the hall's practice rooms, but back in the old neighborhoods. He visited the loading docks, the hospital cafeterias, and the transit hubs. He spoke to the men and women who moved through the city like ghosts, the ones who erases the messes and kept the gears turning. The night of the second recital arrived. Langford had filled the guest list with influencers and high-net-worth individuals, eager to show that he was still the architect of Elias's success. He stood in the lobby, adjusted his silk tie, and waited for the parade of diamonds. But the lobby remained strangely empty. At 7:45 p.m., a fleet of city buses began to pull up to the front of the Grand Overture Hall. From them emerged a different kind of audience. There were cleaning crews in their blue uniforms, construction workers with dust still on their boots, nurses in scrubs, and transit drivers. They held tickets that Elias had personally distributed, purchased using a significant portion of his first salary installment. Langford's face went from pale to purple. What is this? Elias, where are the donors? Where's the press? Elias emerged from the backstage area, dressed not in black, and certainly not in the olive coveralls. He wore a simple, well-worn sweater and trousers, the clothes of a common man. The press is already inside, Arthur, Elias said. I invited them an hour ago. And the audience? They're the people who actually make this city sing. I thought it was time they had the best seats in the house. You're breaking the residency agreement. I'll strip the insurance. You'll do nothing, Elias interrupted, his voice like iron. If you turn these people away now, under the gaze of every major news outlet in the city, you won't just be a failed promoter. You'll be the man who shut the doors on the heartbeat of the city. Sit down, Arthur. You might learn something. Elias walked onto the stage. The hall, usually a bastion of stiff-necked silence, was alive. There was a hum of conversation, the sound of laughter, and the palpable energy of people who felt, for the first time, that they belonged in a temple of art. Maya sat in the very center of the front row. Beside her was Mrs. Gable, and to Elias's surprise, the burly security guard, Dave, who was holding his wife's hand. Elias sat at the Steinway. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He began to play his original work, the Symphony for the Unseen. It began with a low, rhythmic ostinato, the sound of a heartbeat, or perhaps the rhythmic thud of a mop against a bucket. It was a humble beginning, a repetitive, grinding theme that spoke of the monotony of labor. But slowly a melody began to weave through the rhythm. It was a soaring, defiant theme, representing the dreams that people carry into their shifts. The music grew in complexity and scale. Elias used the piano to mimic the sounds of the city, the screech of subway brakes, the distant roar of traffic, the hushed whispers of parents over sleeping children. It was a masterpiece of narrative composition. It told the story of a million people who were invisible, yet essential. As the music reached its crescendo, Elias felt a profound sense of integration. He was no longer the pianist who had to hide his past, nor was he the janitor who had to hide his talent. He was a whole man. The calluses on his fingers were not marks of shame. They were the tools he used to pull the music from the depths of his experience. He played for the man who polished the brass. He played for the woman who scrubbed the toilets. He played for the father who skipped dinner so his daughter could have medicine. The final movement was a soaring, triumphant anthem. It wasn't about escaping the life of labor, but about the dignity within it. It was about being seen. When the final note faded, the silence was different than it had ever been in that hall. It wasn't the silence of awe for a miracle. It was the silence of a shared identity. When the applause came, it was a thunderous, rhythmic stomping of feet that shook the very foundations of the building. It was the sound of a city recognizing itself. Elias stood and walked to the edge of the stage. He reached down and took Maya's hand, pulling her up beside him. Music belongs to everyone, he said, his voice carrying to the back of the rafters without a microphone. Beauty is not a luxury. It is a right. We are all visible tonight. The aftermath of that concert changed the Grand Overture Hall forever. Langford was forced to step down by a board that realized the public mood had shifted. The residency was restructured into the Thorne Foundation, a program designed to find and fund artists working in the trades, the hidden maestros in the factories and the shadows. Years later, Elias Thorne would be remembered as one of the greats. But he never moved into a mansion. He stayed in the city, near the people he played for. Every morning, before he sat down to compose, he would take a moment to look at his old olive coveralls, hung in a glass case in his hallway, not as a trophy of where he had been, but as a reminder of the strength it took to survive. He was no longer the janitor pianist. He was the maestro of the visible. And as he sat down to play for Maya, The music wasn't a secret anymore. It was a symphony, and the whole world was finally listening. The high cost of survival had been paid in full, and the profit was a soul that could finally, truly, be seen.